The Milan Conference of 1880 was one of the most destructive things that affected the deaf community, as it created laws that forbid the use of sign language and only allowed oralism. This meant that children would not be allowed to sign, and they had to learn how to use oralism instead. Edward Minor Gallaudet and Reverend Thomas Gallaudet were at the conference, and they both opposed the resolutions to oralism in order to have the ability to continue using ASL at the high school and college levels of education. This allowed for the continued success of sign language to live on in the higher levels of education. The National Association of the Deaf, also known as NAD, was formed in response to the Milan Conference of 1880 with the goal of preserving ASL. The NAD works for deaf people, but it also works to promote knowledge about the rights, culture, and language of deaf people to hearing people. The NAD fought to keep deaf teachers teaching deaf students, open residential schools for the deaf, advocate for deaf people to take civil service exams, and caption films and sporting events. The NAD really wanted to preserve, protect, and promote the civil, human, and linguistic rights of deaf and hard of hearing individuals in the U.S. About 90 to 95% of the deaf/hard of hearing people are born to hearing parents, and only 1% of these parents become fluent in ASL. These children can experience language deprivation due to this lack of communication with their parents during their foundational years, which leads to mental, social, and cognitive issues in the future, and is why the deaf community is so important to millions of people around the world. In the past, there has been a negative perception of the deaf community. Popular philosophers like Aristotle believed that nothing imperfect should be brought up. This negative attitude continued on forward as time progressed. Moving on to 16th century Spain, one can see the beginnings of deaf education. One of the first few teachers to the deaf was a Benedict monk named Pedro Ponce de Leon, and he taught deaf children of royal families. Some years later, the world's first manuscript on deaf education was published. In the US, there were attempts to establish deaf schools, but the most prominent one was the construction of the American School of the Deaf. Around the 19th century, with the rise of industrialism in America, oralism became prominent. Oralism harmed the deaf community as it often led to language deprivation of many deaf children. However, if we fast forward to today, we can see a better attitude towards the deaf community through the passing of legislation such as the ADA and IDA. Furthermore, deaf students have individual education plans to help them succeed academically. Unfortunately, politics can have a negative impact on the deaf children. With intentions of securing government money, many public schools will discourage deaf children from leaving their schools for the pursuit of better schools that are better equipped to teach deaf students.